I'm excited to tell you about the woman that I'm going to introduce. A few years ago, I worked for the Irish Times out of Dublin and had covered some conflicts and wars in the former Yugoslavia. And got a call from one of my editors one day saying, we'd like you to review a book called The Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. Can you review this book in about 2 weeks? I said, sure, fine. They send me this book. It's 600 pages on genocide. Now, you know, your reaction to this is, oy. I start to read this book, and it was one of the most compelling, fierce books I had ever read in my life. A lot of people agreed, of course, it won the Pulitzer Prize. It won every prize imaginable. Samantha Power had been a reporter covering conflict in the Balkans in 1995, and she decided to write this book where she decided to survey the major genocides of the 20th century. The Bosnian Serbs' eradication of non-Serbs, the Ottoman slaughter of the Armenians, the Nazi Holocaust, Pol Pot's terror in Cambodia, Saddam Hussein's destruction of Kurds in northern Iraq, and the Rwandan Hutu systematic extermination of the Tutsi minority. And what she wanted to find out is why these things happen and how were they permitted to happen. What she found out was quite interesting in her conclusions about particularly why a superpower such as America did not stop these genocides. Part of it was indifference. In her book, she wrote, "No U.S. president has ever suffered politically for his indifference to its occurrence. It is no coincidence that genocide rages on." She also found out that it really just wasn't about getting the word out, that even with news coverage, these things don't stop. She wrote that back in 1915, when communications were primitive, the New York Times managed to publish 145 stories about the Turkish massacre of Armenians. Nearly 80 years later, the same paper reported just 4 days after the beginning of the Rwandan genocide that tens of thousands of Rwandans had already been murdered. It devoted more column inches to the horrors of Bosnia between 1992 and 1995 than it did to any other foreign story. In other words, knowing is not enough. Action and advocacy are called for. I loved the last paragraph of Samantha's book, where she quotes George Bernard Shaw. And she says that Shaw once wrote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. After a century of doing so little to prevent, suppress, and publish genocide, Americans must join and thereby legitimate the ranks of the unreasonable." Well, who better to be an advocate and to accomplish the best of journalism than an unreasonable, Irish-born, Harvard-educated, outraged, and determined woman? In the last 2 years, Samantha Power has made the crisis in Sudan her personal cause. 50,000 people have died in the Sudan and 1.5 million have been ethnically cleansed. As both a scholar and an academic and as a reporter, she traveled back to the Sudan and did the on-the-ground reporting to bring this news to the world. I must tell you, one of the things that she's written about, I mean, this kind of reporting is, you can't overstate how difficult it is. One of the ways that you find out, sometimes one of the first ways you find out that there's been a massacre somewhere is people in a village say they're getting sick from the water. Well, Samantha found out, of course, as in many places in the world, that corpses had been stuffed down the wells. So not only is there a massacre, but the water supply is poisoned and more people die. She did that kind of reporting. She got the word out from the New Yorker to the New York Times to the LA Times to NPR. I think she probably would have written for the National Enquirer if she'd been asked. She's been determined to get the story of Darfur out. In April, she gave compelling testimony to Congress, but it was also prescriptive. She said the U.S. and other Western powers should threaten to impose multilateral targeted sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes against members of Sudan's regime who are most directly responsible for the human rights violations in Darfur. Samantha Power marries the best of journalistic inquiry, which is so different than the adventurism we see in so much reporting today. She has a passion for truth-telling and advocacy, and she demands that we not avert our eyes, that we not choose the comfortable twilight of not knowing. It's my pleasure to introduce Samantha Power.
I'm sure all of you have had a moment where you sort of look around and you say, how the hell did I start keeping this company? The women who were recipients of the award before me bring that thought and that incredulity to mind. I'm so honored to be up here. Those of you who came in, sat down in your seats, noticed you got a little 600-page door prize. Now, I know it doesn't look all that inviting, and it doesn't look like metro reading exactly, but I just want to say something in a sort of give a plea for my little big book. This is not, actually, I'm sort of in the minority here. I don't view this as a book about genocide. I view it as a book about America and its role in the world. And more specifically, the role of the citizens inside America in relationship to the way America conducts its business around the world. That's, to me, what this book is about. Now, it still looks, at American responses to genocide in the 20th century as a way of trying to get at how the system works and how it doesn't work. So if it is too intimidating, if it does seem too dark, I promise you it reads like a novel. But if it doesn't seem compelling to you, just do me one favor. Don't leave it on the chair, leave it on the metro. Give it to your daughter or give it to your neighbor's daughter, because what we have got to figure out a way to do is to breed and nurture new generations, not of bystanders, as people have heard me say, but of upstanders. And I think there are models for behavior. This is a book about bystanding, but told through the lives and the travails of people who really tried to stand up within the U.S. government, outside it, like the women honored here. And slowly but surely they succeeded in moving the proverbial ball down the field. Now, with 9/11, there have been many, many setbacks in terms of the way we conduct our business around the world, but it will be the upstanders who prevail, of course, in the end, but only if we raise, again, a generation to join them. Now, I just want to say a word about, I talk in terms of upstanders and bystanders a lot, but the term that came to mind when I was on the shuttle this morning was not upstanders, in fact, but it was screamers. Now, the concept of the screamer came to my attention when I began reading Arthur Koestler. Now, Arthur Koestler described those frustrated few who spoke up in the newspapers and public meetings against Nazi atrocities around the time of the Second World War as screamers. These were screamers who succeeded in reaching listeners for a moment, only to watch them, quote, shake themselves like puppies who've got their fur wet and return to the blissful place of ignorance and uninvolvement. Koestler went on, he said, you can convince them for an hour, but then their mental half-defense begins to work, and in a week, the shrug of incredulity has returned like a reflex temporarily weakened by shock. Does that sound familiar? Oh, no. Yeah, like puppies shake themselves with their fur wet. Now, I think the people being honored, and I would exclude myself actually, but are the best of the screamers. And the trouble with being a screamer is not that you feel irrelevant, which you do, and it's not that you feel unwelcome or undesirable at a dinner party, which you do, says the ultimate conversation stopper at a dinner party. But the worst thing about being a screamer, the absolute worst thing, is that you feel predictable, and you are made to feel predictable. And there is just nothing worse than approaching somebody, filled with the reality, the human reality of what you have experienced and seen, and to know, with that, Ralph Ellison called it the peculiar disposition behind the whites of the eyes, that they know what's coming. And one of the great questions, and one of the reasons I'm so grateful to Ms. for having this award and for honoring, especially my colleagues here today, is just to give that extra boost to overcoming that feeling of irrelevance, fine, undesirability, fine, but predictability. Before I sit down, I just want to say a word about Darfur, unsurprisingly, and specifically to focus on an aspect of the crisis there that I think would be of interest to you. Now the number of dead is probably over 100,000, I would say, and the number of people, non-Arabs, who are being ethnically cleansed by the Arab regime and its Janjaweed militia is probably close to 2 million. But the story, I think, and the aspect of this that we can draw attention to the overall crisis in Darfur through is rape. And the dirty secret of Darfur is that although we are finally improved humanitarian access and we are managing to reach these 2 million people who are holed up in the most despicable conditions in what are sort of euphemistically called displaced person camps, but are actually just stews of disease and malnutrition. The dirty secret is, number one, those camps are surrounded on all sides by the very Janjaweed who have displaced people from their homes in the first place. They are literally men patrolling on horseback and on camelback with machetes and with guns. And what they are doing is they are awaiting the departure by people within the camps to go and get firewood. Now, some of you, I'm sure, have read about this. The second dirty little secret about humanitarian aid is that it is inedible unless it is heated. So USAID, which is actually doing a very good job of getting food to people, is giving people, as this is how aid comes distributed, this is not a conspiracy, but is giving people corn and wheat and things that are needed in order to keep families alive inside these camps because they have no farming, no sustenance, no self-sustaining means at all anymore. But unless women leave the camps to go and get wood, to heat the food, starvation is the inevitable result. And so what all the focus on reaching people, feeding people, we're feeding symptoms, and we're not dealing with the roots of the problem, which is that unless we stop the Janjaweed, unless we stop the Sudanese government, unless we bring in a protection force, or at a minimum bring in kerosene heaters into these camps, rape is a daily occurrence. As we sit here throughout Darfur, in order to live, in order to feed their families, women are just walking into rape traps, because that's what they are. And as all of you know from the Bosnia days, rape is not a collateral sort of testosterone-induced consequence of genocide and ethnic cleansing. It is an explicit purpose. It is the way of demeaning a people to such an extent that they will not return to their homes and that they will be so degraded that the job will be done not merely by bullet or machete, but by rape. So the thing about Darfur, too, that we see, and this again relates to the prior speakers, is that the right reason to care about the women of Darfur and the men and the children is because of the people of Darfur, of course. But let us not forget that when we allow atrocities like this to occur, I've been to Darfur several times now in the last couple months, this is a failed state waiting to happen. The call has gone out by the Sudanese government, you know, if you aren't having, you know, your fill in Iraq, come to Darfur. There's free land, there's free livestock, there's free humanitarian aid for you to raid and to loot. This is the place where the nests for future horrors against this country are being built as we speak. So as always, we know this from domestic issues as well, when you do the wrong thing, it's usually not merely the wrong thing, it's not merely the immoral thing, it's usually the stupid thing. And that is true in Darfur. So in closing, let me just say that I think we all know that we can rely, it's unfortunate to say this, but we can rely on people to do bad things, to look out for their own wealth or their own power. We can rely on it in Washington, we can rely on it in Darfur. To me, the question of why people do bad things is actually fundamentally uninteresting. I get it, yeah, they're bad, they want lots of things. The really interesting and fundamental question is how can we stop them? And how can we sharpen the powers of imagination that were invoked earlier to such an extent that bystanders move along that continuum and away from that twilight of not knowing to becoming upstanders? And I think the answer is we scream, and eventually, by screaming, it won't be we who are predictable, but it will be change that is inevitable. Thank you.